Hi, this is Jim Dow, and I'm going to do a quick overview of Part 3, Financial Institutions. After you watch this video, you should read the chapter on your own. Basically, this chapter is to introduce the names of some common financial intermediaries you may hear about and talk a little bit about what they do. So when we talk about financial intermediaries, way back in Chapter 1, we talked about how that they connect the suppliers of funds and the demanders of funds, that people who provide money and people who want to borrow money to invest in their business or buy a home or do things like that. And so one of the easy ways to think about a financial institution is through its balance sheet. So a balance sheet, we have assets on one side and liabilities on the other. And the people who provide funds will make a liability on the financial intermediary's balance sheet. And then the financial intermediary will invest in some assets on the asset side of the balance sheet. So let's see how that works in particular cases. Here we have a bank. And so one of the main things banks do is they take deposits and make loans. So an investor deposits funds in the bank, and those deposits are liabilities for the bank. Right? The bank owes the deposits to the investor, so it's a liability for the bank, while it is an asset for the investors. On the other side of the balance sheet are the loans that the bank makes to the borrowers. The loans are an asset for the bank. There's something that they are going to get paid, but the loans represent a liability to the borrower. There's something they owe. Banks make profit on what's called an interest rate spread. An interest rate spread is a difference between two interest rates. For example, a bank might charge 8% on a loan, but only pay 5% to the depositors. The bank earns the difference between the two, that is a 3% interest rate spread, and that's one of the ways banks make money. We have a few paragraphs here about banking history. If you'd like to learn more about that, we offer a class, Finance 438, that talks a lot about financial institutions. Sometimes you hear the name credit unions and savings banks, and there's some regulatory differences between these institutions and what we call commercial banks, but really they all do the same kind of thing. They take deposits and make loans, so we can think about them in the same way. Credit scoring is one of the ways that a bank or other institutions evaluates whether someone gets a loan. Right? There's a lot of things that go into determining whether an individual is likely to pay the loan back, which matters a lot to the bank. And they could have somebody sit down and go through that individual's record by hand, but it's easier if they have a computer do it. So there's computer algorithms that look at your history of repaying your loans and borrowing money, and they come up with a numerical score, a number that's your credit score, and then they can use that to determine whether or not they make you a loan. There are other financial intermediaries. We'll talk a lot more about mutual funds at the end of the class. But when you think about a mutual fund, we again can look at its balance sheet. So if you were going to buy some stocks, you might go to a brokerage and give them money, and they would go buy the stocks for you and hold it into an account. But another way you could do this is if you give your money to a mutual fund, they could take it and again buy stocks and bonds, but they would hold that in a portfolio. So you don't own any particular stock or bond. What you have are shares in that portfolio. So that's why on the balance sheet of the mutual fund, the liabilities are the shares in the fund that represent an asset for the investors and a liability for the mutual fund. And they take that money and again, they invest it in a portfolio of stocks and bonds, which is an asset for the mutual fund and represents a liability in the case of bonds, something that they owe to the mutual fund, the companies that issued the bonds. Insurance companies are another kind of financial intermediary. People buy policies and give the insurance company money, and the insurance company will invest that money, typically in bonds, and that's part of what they use to repay the holders of the insurance policies if they have an accident or on death or something like that. Pension funds are an important kind of financial institution. So a pension is what happens when you've worked for a long time and maybe you're 65 and you're retired and you hope to have some money to live on. There are two different kinds of pension funds, defined benefit and defined contribution pension funds. And we'll walk through both of them. In a defined benefit pension fund, workers and the firm contribute to the plan, and then that money is invested in stocks and bonds. So if you see the balance sheet of the defined benefit pension fund, assets are stocks and bonds, the investments that they make, and the pension is what they owe the workers. And what makes a defined benefit pension fund defined benefit is that the benefit is defined in terms of how many years you worked for the company and what salary you had. So if you'd worked for 30 years and you had a salary of so much, that would determine how much you get paid in your pension. It doesn't matter how the stocks and bonds perform. It's up to the company to make sure they've made the right investments so that they can pay you the pension that they owe you. So the risk in this kind of pension fund goes on the company. Because of that and some other reasons, defined benefit pension funds have been a lot less common, and a lot of companies are shifting over to what are called defined contribution pension funds. In a defined contribution pension fund, it works in a similar way, except in terms of who bears the risk. So the workers and maybe the firm contribute to the plan, and so the workers have an account with the pension, and that account is invested in stocks and bonds. The difference is the amount you get at the end doesn't come from a formula. It depends on how the stocks and bonds did. If the stocks and bonds did great, you have a lot of money at retirement. If they did poorly, well, you're out of luck. Okay? So the risk goes, instead of being on the company, the risk goes to the worker. These are pretty common plans these days. You may have heard of them, like a 401k plan at your employer. And because so much of the results depend on investing wisely, this is why everybody needs to have a little bit of education in investing in order to at least know what's going on with their 401k plan. Last thing I want to mention is the Federal Reserve. You've heard about the Federal Reserve before in your macroeconomics course. Just to remind you that, again, that's an important player in the financial markets.